A verse-by-verse study in the Book of Daniel, ESV, with Irv Risch, Chapter 3. What does Daniel chapter 3 mean? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were among those captured from Judah to serve the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 1 verses 1-6. They were given Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verse 7. After God intervened to reveal the king's dream, through Daniel, Daniel 2 verses 17-20, the Hebrews were given promotions, Daniel 2 verses 46-49. Chapter 3 contains the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their rescue from a blazing furnace. This is part of the Old Testament recorded in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, Daniel 2:4, 7:28, emphasizing its relevance to the non-Jewish nations of the world. The passage is filled with obvious repetition. This seems to be a poetic reference to the bureaucratic, overbearing nature of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Daniel exactly repeats the roster of government officials, Daniel 3 verses 2-3, gives the same list of instruments 4 times, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 10, 15, describes the execution device as a burning fiery furnace 8 times, Daniel 3 verses 6 and 11, 15, 17, 20, 21, 23, 26, and refers to the 3 Hebrew men with the exact phrase, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 13 times, Daniel 3 verses 12 and 13, 14, 16, 19, 20, 22, 23, 26, 28, 29, 30. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he saw a golden head representing himself as the leader of Babylon, Daniel 2 verses 36-38. This may have inspired him to commission the object at the center of this chapter's events. He commands the building of a large golden idol. This might have been a statue, or an obelisk, or some other shape. The king calls representatives from government offices all over Babylon to participate in the idol's introduction, Daniel 3 verses 1-2. The king commands all those in attendance to bow and worship this image upon hearing a certain musical cue. The list of instruments seems to imply a wide variety of styles. Likewise, the assembled officials represent their varied territories and people. Babylon's conquering influence extended over many regions and cultures. That control demanded obedience, so the king threatens a gruesome death to anyone who disobeys this order, Daniel 3 verses 3-7. Loyalty and submission were likely the main purpose of this golden idol. In Babylonian society, there were many gods. The idea of worshipping more than one deity was considered normal. By creating this image, Nebuchadnezzar was probably proclaiming Babylon and its gods as supreme over all others. For most people in that era, submitting to his command would have been well within their religious convictions. Those advisors who survived Nebuchadnezzar's wrath over his dream, Daniel 2 verses 8-16, might have been jealous of the Hebrews who were rewarded. A group from the Chaldeans, or astrologers, accused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of disobeying the king's command. This is described as malicious by a phrase implying spite and ill intent. The complaint is not inspired by loyalty to the king, but by pure hatred for the Jews. It's entirely possible the accusers had no idea whether their accusation was true, but merely hoped to harass the 3 men or see if the king's short temper would take over, Daniel 3 verses 8-12. Daniel is notably absent from this incident. Commentators speculate that he was away on business and was not called to the ceremony. It's also possible that Daniel was considered too powerful and too popular with the king to threaten at this time. Given his history, Daniel 1 verses 8-16, and future choices, Daniel 6, there's no question that if Daniel was there, he likewise refused to commit idolatry. Daniel's absence or the accuser's cowardice are the most likely reasons he is not part of this story. It's possible Nebuchadnezzar was still suspicious of his advisors, Daniel 2 verses 8-11. Despite being furious, he asks the 3 Hebrew men if the charges are true. At the same time, he provides a way for them to prove their loyalty through obedience. Most likely, the king intended to command the musical signal at once so they could bow before the idol. He also gloats about his own power, suggesting that no being, even a divine one, could save them if they refused, Daniel 3 verses 13 to 15. Whether the accusation was invented or not, the three Hebrew men tell the king not to bother with his test. They have not worshipped the idol, and they will not worship it, even if it means their own death.
Lord, please let us understand your word.
Instead of fear of Nebuchadnezzar, they express trust in their God. Their Lord can save them, but even if they die, they will continue to obey him instead of a pagan king, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. Nebuchadnezzar was already angry. Now, his rage boils over into a royal temper tantrum. He issues a series of irrational commands, all in a spiteful attempt to prove his power over those who dared defy him. The furnace in question was probably a lime kiln, an earthen structure with a partially open top and a hole on one side. This is to be superheated, though a normal kiln would be more than hot enough to kill. The three men are to be thrown in immediately, not waiting to have their ceremonial clothes removed. They are to be tied up, despite that being unnecessary. The orders are so absurd, and so urgent, that the soldiers pushing the three men into the furnace are themselves killed, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 23. A minority of scholars suggest that what happens next is a vision, that Nebuchadnezzar was not looking into the flames, but spiritually perceiving something that made him call out. In context, it seems much more likely that he took a seat where he could look into the furnace, probably through the side opening. But as soon as he does so, he stands up in shock. His question to his advisors is much like asking, "Am I seeing things? Do you see what I see?" Only 3 bodies went into the flames, but the king sees 4 men. One of those has an overtly supernatural appearance. Nebuchadnezzar's comment is best translated as seeing something like a son of the gods. This might have been the archangel Michael, Daniel 10 verse 13, 12:1, or even a pre-incarnate Jesus, Daniel 3 verses 24 to 25. In amazement, the king calls out to the 3 Hebrew men, asking them to exit the furnace. When they emerge, they have been perfectly and completely protected from the flames. Every facet of Nebuchadnezzar's attempt is a complete failure. He ordered the Jewish captives to die by fire, in their clothes, and tied up. They survived, not even singed, came out untied, and without so much as the smell of smoke on their clothes, and the only deaths were of the Babylonian soldiers who pushed them in. This inspires Nebuchadnezzar to make an astonishing claim: the men were right to disobey his command. Rather than driven to further rage, he is awed into respect at the power of the Hebrew God, Daniel 3 verses 26 to 28. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is not fully embracing the Lord of Israel as the one true God. He still believes in other deities but accepts that the Hebrew God is powerful enough to protect his worshippers. The king's basic personality is also unchanged. As before, he declares his opinion and threatens anyone who disagrees with violent consequences. He then rewards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in some way. That might have meant even greater power and responsibility, or simply his continued favor, Daniel 3 verses 29 to 30. This incident emphasizes the absolute power of God, above and beyond any human ruler. It also celebrates faith in the face of danger, as well as faith which accepts that God will not always rescue his people from earthly harm. The Book of Revelation echoes many of these themes as the end-times Antichrist persecutes believers and the restored Jewish nation. These 3 Hebrew men are not mentioned in Scripture again. Upcoming chapters will continue, in the Aramaic language, to speak about the Gentile world and Daniel's experiences under pagan kings. Later chapters will turn to end-times prophecy. Chapter context: the first chapter of Daniel explained how 4 captive Israelite boys became respected advisors to a Babylonian king. Chapter 2 showed these men praying for divine wisdom to untangle that same king's dream. These events set the stage for this chapter and the famous trio of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The men refuse to bow to an idol and are rescued from fiery death by God. This is the last mention of these men in Scripture, as focus shifts back to Babylon's kings and the prophet Daniel. Verse by verse. Verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Daniel 1 verses 1-2, recently experienced a troubling dream, Daniel 2 verses 1-3. Only Daniel, empowered by God, was able to untangle that mystery, Daniel 2 verses 17-19, 27-28. Part of the dream included a statue with an enormous golden head, Daniel 2 verse 32. This represented Nebuchadnezzar's rule over Babylon, Daniel 2 verses 37-38. Though the king recognized the power of Daniel's God, Daniel 2 verse 47, he did not abandon belief in other deities. Nor, it seems, did he restrain his pride. The construction of a large golden idol, after being told the meaning of his dream, suggests Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance. Scripture does not indicate exactly when this happened. Some commentators believe this idol was built soon after the interpretation of the dream, others think it might have been as much as 20 years later. The image is not described except as being very tall and relatively slender. This may have been an obelisk-shaped monument, or a human figure with distorted proportions. Most likely, it was made of wood and overlaid with gold. Scholars are unsure of the exact meaning of the plain of Dura. The term Dura may have been a generic word for flat areas surrounded by walls. Various pedestals, hills, mounds, and platforms in the region have been suggested as possible sites for the golden image. Certainly, it was meant to be as visible as possible. Context summary: Daniel 3 verses 1-7 follows the incident where Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's frightening dream. It's possible that the king took pride in being depicted as a head of gold, Daniel 2 verses 37-38, and so he makes a golden image of himself to be revered. The people of Babylon are commanded to worship this idol under threat of death, being burned alive. Repetition in the passage highlights the overbearing, controlling nature of the king's edict. This passage continues a segment of the Bible recorded in Aramaic, Daniel 2:4, 7:28. Verse 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Nebuchadnezzar arranged for officials from his entire empire to gather for the dedication of his golden image, Daniel 3 verse 1. This object may have been inspired by the king's pride at being the golden head of his own dream, as interpreted by Daniel, Daniel 2 verses 36-38. As with many state-ordered gatherings, this was to emphasize the ruler's power and authority. In the same way, the golden image was probably created to symbolize the supremacy of Babylon and its king. Bowing before the image, Daniel 3 verse 5, would symbolize total submission to the nation of Babylon, its gods, and its ruler. The same titles for Babylonian officials are repeated multiple times in this passage. This repetition, itself, serves a literary purpose. The king's edict, Daniel 3 verses 4-7, will be all-encompassing and detailed. By repeating detailed lists over and over, Daniel evokes the exhausting bureaucracy of Nebuchadnezzar's dictatorship. The same technique is used with the instruments being played, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 10, 15, and more than a dozen times with the names of 3 Hebrew men, Daniel 3 verses 12-14, 16, 19-20, 22-23, 26, 28-30. In addition, the described positions seem to overlap. Rather than this being a detailed list of the groups invited, it may be a statement that Nebuchadnezzar summoned all high officials from the entire country to attend the event. Zedekiah, king of Judah, may have been summoned to Babylon for the dedication of the golden image, Jeremiah 51 verse 59. Satraps were Nebuchadnezzar's chief representatives over a given region, something like supreme governors. Prefects commanded military units. Governors may have been leaders of civil government, or lower-powered versions of satraps. The counselors were lawyers or guardians of the law. Treasurers were responsible for the public finances. The justices administered the law. Magistrates pronounced sentences on violators of the law. The officials served under the chief governors of the provinces and included all who served Nebuchadnezzar in an official capacity. A notable name missing from this list is Daniel, Daniel 2 verses 46 to 49. It may be that he was exempt, due to his other duties. Or, that he was out of the country at the time on some political mission. Another possibility is that Daniel was there and reacted in the same way as his Hebrew friends, Daniel 3 verse 12, yet his enemies were afraid to challenge him at that time, after his miraculous interpretation of the king's dream. Verse 3. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. After hearing the interpretation of his dream, Daniel 2 verse 36, Nebuchadnezzar creates some sort of enormous idol and commands high officials from all over the empire to attend its dedication, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 2. The list here is identical to that in the prior verse, Daniel 3 verse 2, with a long list of positions and job titles. That repetition suggests the oppressive and intrusive nature of the king's upcoming command, Daniel 3 verses 4 to 6. This chapter will make a point of repeating certain phrases and lists, possibly to continue emphasizing this idea. Some commentators suggest that Nebuchadnezzar set up the golden image to prove he had not abandoned the polytheistic religion of the Babylonians. He had, after all, praised Daniel's God, Daniel 2 verse 47. Others speculate that the occasion was a celebration of Nebuchadnezzar's many military victories. It seems most likely that Nebuchadnezzar wanted everyone in his kingdom to see him as the majestic, supreme ruler over Babylon's many provinces. Bowing to the image would symbolize submission to the power and religion of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's construction of the golden image on the plain of Dura prefigures the construction of the image of the beast by the false prophet of Israel in the tribulation, Revelation 13 verses 11 to 15. Verse 4. And the herald proclaimed aloud, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. King Nebuchadnezzar learned that his dream, Daniel 2 verses 1 to 3, included a representation of Babylon as a golden head, Daniel 2 verses 36 to 38. Perhaps out of pride, or to reiterate his commitment to Babylonian religion, he has ordered construction of a large golden idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 3. Officials from all over the kingdom have been summoned, they will be ordered to bow before this object on command. The signal for worship will be the sound of many instruments, Daniel 3 verse 5. The purpose of this meeting, and the idol, is to prove that Babylon rules over all the entire Middle East. So, the king's command is directed, poetically, at peoples, nations, and languages. A similar meaning is contained in the use of a long list of musical objects in the following verse. The instruments themselves come from a wide variety of ancient Middle Eastern regions and cultures. A herald in the ancient world served something of the same role as a modern broadcaster or spokesman. He would announce important news and events in a public place so many people would hear him. Heralds were fast runners and loud talkers. The Apostle Paul might be considered a herald because he proclaimed the gospel clearly wherever he went, see Acts 20 verse 25, 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 9. Today, Christians act as heralds by proclaiming the gospel to others, Romans 10 verses 14 to 15. Nebuchadnezzar set up his image at the beginning of what is often called the times of the Gentiles, Luke 21 verse 24. The false prophet of Revelation chapter 13 will set up the image to the beast at the completion of this era, in the end times. Both Nebuchadnezzar and the false prophet of the tribulation period demand that everyone worship their image. The worship of Nebuchadnezzar's image was not optional, Daniel 3 verse 6. Verse 5. That when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Babylon effectively ruled over the entire ancient Middle East. The king's commands in this passage emphasize this fact. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel 2 verses 1-3, apparently inspired him to create a large golden idol, Daniel 2 verses 36-38, 3:1. He commanded officials from all over the empire to attend a dedication, Daniel 3 verses 2-3. His command, contained here, was delivered in both poetic and literal terms to every person in the entire kingdom, Daniel 3 verse 4. Throughout history, music has been used to stir emotions and bring about a desired response. Here, the meaning of the long list of musical objects is more symbolic than literal. This passage in Daniel notably repeats several phrases, including 4 copies of the same list of instruments, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 10, 15. This evokes the legalistic, oppressive nature of the king's commands. The wide variety of instruments also implies the large reach of the Babylonian Empire. To fall down, in this context, means to kneel or lay face down in an expression of humility. When the people hear every kind of music as a cue, they are to worship this idol commissioned by Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 6. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. After hearing the interpretation of his dream, Daniel 2 verses 1-3, 36-38, Nebuchadnezzar decided to build a golden idol, Daniel 3 verse 1. This might have been to represent himself, to affirm his commitment to Babylonian gods, or to celebrate some occasion. He ordered powerful people from all over the empire, Daniel 3 verses 2-3, and gave them strict instructions. When they hear a musical cue, all of them are to bow in worship of this man-made object, Daniel 3 verses 4-5. The penalty for disobedience is an immediate, horrific death by fire. The furnace in question was probably a type of kiln used to create lime. This would have been a domed surface with an opening on top to insert fuel and a space at the bottom to remove ashes and waste. For centuries in Babylonian culture, being burnt alive had been a traditional punishment for blasphemy, Jeremiah 29 verse 22. Not only is the process presumed to be painful, but it is also thorough, capable of destroying the body entirely and leaving little to no trace. This chapter repeats this exact phrase multiple times, echoing the legalism and bureaucracy of Babylon. Persian culture considered fire too holy for use as an execution tool. This is likely why Darius, a later king, Daniel 2 verses 37-39, used a lion pit as the severest punishment for disobedience, Daniel 6 verse 7. Verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Babylonian culture believed in many deities. They expected their subjects to have varied beliefs about which gods to worship. The idol created by Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 3 verse 1, represented the supremacy of Babylon and its religion over those of its subjects. In the king's mind, there was no reason for a person to refuse his command to worship the image, Daniel 3 verses 2-6, unless they were refusing to submit to Babylon. Most of his subjects would have felt the same, with few objections to the order. Nebuchadnezzar was willing to admit the power of Daniel's God, Daniel 2 verses 46-47, but had not come to worship the Lord as the one true God. The musical cue for this act of worship was the playing of a wide variety of musical tools, Daniel 3 verse 5. The previous list of instruments is repeated exactly here and will be used 2 more times in this passage, Daniel 3 verses 10 and 15. The repetition emphasizes the tight control and all-encompassing nature of Nebuchadnezzar's decrees. Under threat of execution, those present at the dedication ceremony kowtow and worship the man-made object. However, some resisted. Daniel's 3 friends, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, will soon be accused of disobeying the king's order, a charge they openly admit, Daniel 3:12, 16 to 18. Daniel is not mentioned in this incident. It's plausible that he was not present, or that the jealous court advisors were too afraid to challenge him, Daniel 2 verse 48. What's implausible is that Daniel chose to dishonor God by committing idolatry, Daniel 1 verse 8, 6:5, 10. In the end-times tribulation period, another despot will command everyone to worship an image. Those who comply with the command will receive a mark on the right hand or forehead that will allow them to buy and sell. Many who refuse to worship the image will die, Revelation 13 verses 11 to 17. Verse 8. Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, Daniel 1 verses 1 to 2, he took children from noble families to become advisors to his court, Daniel 1 verses 3 to 5. 4 of these Hebrew captives were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They would be renamed Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7. When the king's magicians failed to interpret his dream, Daniel 2 verses 1 to 3, 8 to 12, an answer came only after these men prayed to the God of Israel, Daniel 2 verses 17 to 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed that he gave the Israelite captives great power and prestige, Daniel 2 verses 46 to 49. Also in response to the dream, it seems, Nebuchadnezzar built a huge idol and commanded his entire nation to worship it, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7. As Jews, the 4 captive Israelites stood out from the Chaldeans as men who worshipped one God, the true God, instead of numerous false gods. While these men were known for skill, Daniel 1 verses 17 to 20, they were also passionately faithful to this truth, Daniel 1 verses 8 to 16. They refused the king's request, regardless of threats, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. The term Chaldean refers both to a culture and to a profession. The Chaldean people were so associated with divination and astrology that such experts were generically referred to as Chaldeans. These men had failed to meet the king's earlier challenge, Daniel 2 verses 10 to 11, over which at least some had probably been killed, Daniel 2 verses 12 to 13. Rather than making them grateful for surviving, the ordeal seems to have prompted them to become bitter and jealous. The Aramaic phrasing used here for the accusation literally refers to devouring something. As a figure of speech, it means destructive, hateful slander. It's possible the accusers didn't know that the faithful Hebrews had, in fact, disobeyed, Daniel 3 verse 12, and they simply wanted to bully and harass them. In modern speech, slander is usually reserved for words which are provably false. The same is usually true in Scripture, though here the focus is more on intent. These Babylonian men are motivated by spite and hatred, not loyalty or moral principles. They act for no other reason than malice. Whether their words are true or false, they are still slander because of that motivation. This incident also proves that the evil of anti-Semitism has a long, sordid history. It can take many forms, from subtle bias to personal vendettas such as this incident. It can even come as a wide effort to exterminate Jewish people, Esther 3 verse 6. However, God has always had a faithful remnant. Even in the future tribulation, a core of saved Jews will refuse to worship the image that the false prophet sets up in the temple. Many will suffer martyrdom while others will survive the Antichrist's wrath. Romans 11 verses 26 to 27 promises, all Israel, some from every tribe of Israel, will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Context summary: Daniel 3 verses 8 to 18 records an accusation, a confrontation, and a confession. Daniel's three friends, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, are reported to the king by jealous advisers who claim the Jewish men refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, Daniel 3:1, 4-5. The king offers them an opportunity to disprove the charge, or at least to change their minds. Instead, the three faithful men admit they have not and will not compromise their faith in the one true God. Whether they live or die, they will not worship the false gods of Babylon. This passage is part of the scriptures recorded in Aramaic, Daniel 2:4, 7-28. Verse 9. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." Astrologers from King Nebuchadnezzar's court are accusing Jews captured from Judah and forced to serve as advisors, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, 3:8. As a whole, their group failed to interpret the king's dream, Daniel 2 verses 8-11, and only survived because of God's miraculous intervention through Daniel, Daniel 2 verses 17-19. In response, the king appointed the Hebrew men to important roles, Daniel 2 verses 48-49. This seems to have inspired jealousy in the court astrologers, Daniel 3 verse 12. When the king orders everyone to worship an idol, on pain of death, the bitter Chaldeans see an opportunity to harass the Jewish captives, Daniel 3 verses 1-7. They will accuse three of the men of defying the royal order. The Chaldean accusers flatter Nebuchadnezzar before spelling out the details of their accusation. The book of Daniel makes it clear that Nebuchadnezzar had a huge ego, he was extremely impressed by himself. Yet, the greeting used here was common for rulers of the ancient Middle East, 1 Kings 1 verse 31, Nehemiah 2 verse 3, Daniel 2 verse 4, 6:21. In that era, it was commonly believed that long life was a special blessing and a sign of divine approval. The Chaldeans' expression implied that they wanted Nebuchadnezzar to enjoy a long, happy life. Scripture indicates that longevity can be one of the benefits associated with obedience to the Lord's commands. One of the 10 commandments includes such a remark, Exodus 20 verse 12, Ephesians 6 verses 2-3. Verse 10. You, O king, have made a decree, that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. The accusing Chaldeans, Daniel 3 verses 8-9, remind King Nebuchadnezzar of his recent command, that at a certain musical signal, everyone was to worship the golden image he had constructed, Daniel 3 verses 1-7. Their target will be three of the captive Hebrews, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, 3:12, who were recently honored by the king, Daniel 2 verses 48-49. The way their attack is described indicates pure malice. It's even possible they simply invented the accusation. And yet, it turns out to be true, the Hebrew men did not, and would not, bow to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16-18. Scripture isn't clear if these accusers were among the same men who failed to discern Nebuchadnezzar's frightening dream, Daniel 2 verses 8-11. If they were the same men, they had been under a death sentence until Daniel saved them and all the other wise men of Babylon, Daniel 2:12, 17-19. They should have been grateful to the Jewish people, but instead they seem jealous. These men may have proven themselves frauds when they could not solve the mystery of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but here they are very crafty. No doubt their reminder to the king was intended to prod him to take swift action to carry out his own threat. This verse is one of several, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 15, which repeats the same list of musical instruments. This duplication subtly mocks the bureaucratic, heavy-handed nature of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Verse 11. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. When Nebuchadnezzar's astrologers failed to uncover the secret of his dream, he ordered them all killed, Daniel 2 verses 8-12. Yet Daniel, one of the Hebrew captives, was able to solve the riddle and end the threat, Daniel 2 verses 17 to 19. In response, the king promoted Daniel and his 3 Jewish friends to high authority, Daniel 2 verses 48 to 49. This seems to have made other advisors jealous. They will accuse, with pure malice, Daniel 3 verses 8 and 12, that 3 of the men refused to worship the king's golden idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7. The accusers reminded Nebuchadnezzar of the penalty he decreed, being burnt alive. The world has always included those who don't merely want to punish God's people, but to wipe them from the face of the earth. Hebrews chapter 11 mentions believers who were killed for their faith. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, Hebrews 11 verse 37. The devil who opposes God and God's people lurks behind vicious persecutors. When the risen Lord addressed the church in Smyrna, he predicted, "Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Revelation 2 verse 10. An earlier verse noted that the men's accusation was malicious and slanderous, Daniel 3 verse 8. Their intent was not honorable, regardless of whether it was true. In fact, their claim may have been invented. They may have had no idea whether the Jews worshipped the statue, but simply wanted to bully them. And yet, the accused Hebrews will openly refuse to bow to a pagan idol, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. Verse 12. Here are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you, they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. King Nebuchadnezzar nearly executed all his advisors over a disturbing dream, Daniel 2 verses 8 to 12. One of the Hebrew captives, Daniel, was given a vision from God which solved the mystery, Daniel 2 verses 17 to 19. In response, the king elevated the 4 Jewish men to positions of power, Daniel 2 verses 48 to 49. This likely made others in the court jealous. Later, Nebuchadnezzar ordered all people to worship his new golden idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7. The bitter Chaldeans, astrologers from Babylon, used this opportunity to harass the Israelite men, Daniel 3 verses 8 to 11. Satan was certainly behind the Chaldeans' accusation. Revelation 12 verse 10 identifies the devil as the accuser of our brothers, and describes him as accusing them day and night before God. These critics accused the 3 men of failing to serve Nebuchadnezzar's gods and refusing to worship his golden image. In that culture, it was common to believe in many gods. Few people would have been offended at the command to honor one more idol. Nebuchadnezzar's command was probably more a matter of politics and egotism than religious piety. Yet the Hebrews believed in the one true God and refused to worship false deities, Exodus 20 verses 3 to 6. It is noteworthy that this accusation targets only 3 men. No mention is made of Daniel, who was notably pious about his faith, Daniel 1 verses 8 to 16. It's feasible to think he was not accused because the Chaldeans thought he was too powerful, or too popular with the king. It's also possible he was away on official business when the idol was to be worshipped. Then again, the men who make this claim do so out of pure malice, Daniel 3 verse 8. It may have been they simply wanted to harass the Jews, and didn't know that they had, in fact, disobeyed the order. Also not mentioned are any of the other Jewish captives brought from Judah, Daniel 1 verses 1 to 5. Perhaps many disobeyed, yet avoided being accused because they were unimportant, or unnoticed. Or, they may have compromised their traditional faith to avoid punishment. Scripture does not say which was the case. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar in furious rage commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. The Chaldeans' accusation, Daniel 3 verse 12, against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, 2:48-49, infuriated Nebuchadnezzar. The king has already demonstrated violent anger when he does not get his way, Daniel 2 verse 12. However, he has also shown suspicion of his court advisors, Daniel 2 verses 8-11. When astrologers claimed that Daniel's 3 friends defied a royal decree to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 1-7, he summons the men and questions them, Daniel 3 verse 14, rather than simply ordering their deaths. This incident resembles the experience of Jesus, accused of blasphemy and insurrection, standing before Governor Pilate, Matthew 27 verses 1-11. It also shares some aspects with the Apostle Paul standing before Governor Felix, Acts 24 verses 1-10, and before King Agrippa, 25:13, 26:1. Jesus told his disciples that people would drag them before governors and kings for his sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles, Matthew 10 verse 18. Verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Nebuchadnezzar is investigating an accusation against 3 captive Hebrews, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, made by his court astrologers, Daniel 3 verses 8-12. The men being interrogated were given positions of great power, Daniel 2 verses 48-49, after Daniel, a fellow Hebrew, successfully interpreted the king's dream, Daniel 2 verses 17-19. Rather than simply having the men killed, he asks for their response. This may reflect Nebuchadnezzar's mistrust of some of his advisors, Daniel 2 verses 8-11. It's entirely possible their claim, Daniel 3 verse 12, was invented merely to harass the Jewish men, yet the accused will openly admit their defiance of the king's order, Daniel 3 verses 16-18. Christians often find themselves in situations where compromising faith would make them more popular, or more comfortable, or physically safer. Yet believers ought to stand fast in the Lord and refuse to compromise their faith. Knowing an honest answer would bring painful death, what would most people tell the king? Would they give an answer that would please the king of Babylon or one that would please the king of heaven and earth? Verse 15. Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? It's possible Nebuchadnezzar did not fully trust his court advisors, Daniel 2 verses 8-11. When he elevated certain captive Jewish men, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, to positions of power, Daniel 2 verses 48-49, it may have inspired jealousy. The claim that these men did not follow a command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 1-7, may have been completely fabricated, Daniel 3 verse 8. In other words, it's possible that the accusers were merely harassing the Hebrew men out of spite. The king calls the 3 men and interrogates them about their obedience. Here, he offers them an opportunity to prove their submission to his rule. Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as more authoritative and powerful than any god. He thought no god could undo his sentence of death. His question is rhetorical, a statement of his view that no deity could keep someone from death if the king of Babylon so ordered. Yet the king failed to realize that the God of the 3 Jews wasn't just another pagan idol. Their God created the heavens and earth, Genesis 1 verse 1, controlled all nature, and could surely deliver his faithful worshippers from the burning fiery furnace. If Nebuchadnezzar cast Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace, he would be setting up a conflict between himself and the one and only true God. The 3 men won't dispute the charges against them, nor wait for the next command to worship. Instead, they neatly inform Nebuchadnezzar that they refuse to participate in idolatry, Daniel 3 verses 16-18. This verse is one of several which repeats the exact same list of musical instruments, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 10. That repetition may be a way of satirizing Babylon's overly controlling, bureaucratic nature. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. When an accused person is brought to court, they are offered the chance to make a plea, a response to the charges against them. When Nebuchadnezzar summoned 3 Hebrews, Daniel 3 verses 8 and 13, accused of defying his command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7, he gave them a choice: bow to the idol at the next command or be burnt alive, Daniel 3 verses 14 to 15. The Hebrew men's response is the equivalent of pleading guilty. They note there is no reason for them to answer or defend themselves. They did not, and will not, worship a false god. They make no attempt to explain or justify their faith. They simply refuse to follow the king's command and accept the consequences, Daniel 3 verses 17 to 18. Also worth noting is that the 3 Jews did not ask Nebuchadnezzar to pardon them or ignore their crime. They knew the law, and knew the consequences, but were determined to obey God instead of men, Acts 5 verse 29. When Paul was undergoing a court trial that would decide whether he would be released from prison or experience capital punishment, he did not flinch. He was prepared for either result. Writing to the Philippians, he testifies, "As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage and now as always Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death," Philippians 1 verse 20. Verse 17. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, showed resolute trust in God. Their earthly king commanded them to worship an idol to prove their loyalty and avoid a gruesome death, Daniel 3 verses 13 to 15. Yet they refused. Here, the men point out their confidence that God, the one true God of Israel, would keep them safe even from the great king Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps the Hebrew men recalled God's promise in Isaiah 43 verses 2 to 3, "When you walk through fire you shall not be burned, and the flames shall not consume you. For I am the El your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." They knew how God had delivered his people from Pharaoh's cavalry. Hemmed in at the Red Sea, the Hebrews witnessed God's miraculous deliverance. They crossed the Red Sea safely on dry ground, whereas the pursuing cavalry drowned in its returning water, Exodus 14. These men are not foolish. They know it's entirely possible, highly likely, in fact, that they will die horribly for defying a pagan king, Daniel 3 verse 18. Yet they exhibit the same faith as Abraham. Hebrews 11 verse 19 explains that when Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, Genesis 22 verses 1 to 2, he believed God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead. Verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 3 verses 14 to 17, demonstrate intense trust in God. They know the Lord is powerful enough to rescue them from the consequences of defying Nebuchadnezzar's command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7, but they don't demand that he do so. They did not know whether God would deliver them or allow them to die in the flames. They knew, however, that he was able to deliver them. In either case, they clearly told the king that they would not serve his heathen gods or worship his golden image. They were determined to be faithful to God, no matter what. Even if that meant death, they trusted the Lord with the outcome. Exodus 20 verses 3 to 5 was indelibly stamped on the hearts of these Hebrew slaves: "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." New Testament believers, too, must disdain idolatry. In Colossians 3 verse 5 Paul equates covetousness with idolatry, and the Apostle John writes in 1 John 5 verse 21, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. In arrogance, Nebuchadnezzar, the temperamental king of Babylon, Daniel 2 verse 12, had commanded everyone to worship a golden idol, Daniel 3 verses 1-7. 3 Hebrew men, Daniel 3 verse 12, were accused of ignoring that order and openly refused to comply, Daniel 3 verses 16-18. The king's change of expression and instructions about the furnace reflect his ever-increasing rage, Daniel 3 verse 13. His decree is not a measured application of law, but a temper tantrum from a man accustomed to getting his way. The furnace, in question, Daniel 3 verses 6 and 11, 15, 17, was probably a lime kiln. These were domed, earthen structures with an opening on top to insert material and a hole on the side to remove ashes and waste. Like a blacksmith's forge, the right combination of fuel and air flow could create phenomenal levels of heat. Being burnt alive was a traditional Babylonian punishment for blasphemers, Jeremiah 29 verse 22. In this case, Nebuchadnezzar fails to realize that a superheated furnace would put anyone who came near it at risk, Daniel 3 verse 22. It would also create a faster, less painful death for the 3 men. His only desire seems to be displaying as much power against these disobedient Hebrews as possible. Nebuchadnezzar also failed to realize that the God the 3 men worshipped and served could protect them from the fire. He will soon learn that his earlier bragging, Daniel 3 verse 15, was mistaken, Daniel 3 verses 24-25. Context summary: Daniel 3 verses 19-25 follows the description of Nebuchadnezzar's angry response to an accusation, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, Daniel 3 verses 1-7, 8-12. Rather than begging for mercy, the men openly refused to commit idolatry, Daniel 3 verses 16-18. This enrages the king, who tries to make an example of them, which is thwarted by God, Daniel 3 verses 22-27. The passage is recorded in Aramaic, highlighting its importance to non-Jewish people of the ancient world. Verse 20. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These 3 Hebrew men were among those captured from Judah and made to serve the king of Babylon, Daniel 1 verses 1-7. They openly refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's golden idol, Daniel 3 verses 16-18, driving the king into an irrational rage. He ordered a furnace, probably a lime kiln, superheated, Daniel 3 verse 19, and now commands that the men be tied up. Kilns such as these were usually made of earth, with carefully sized openings on top and on one side. Even at normal burning temperatures, it would be unlikely for anyone to be able to climb out if they fell in. The fact that the furnace is superheated makes this even less of a risk, yet the king demands his victims be tied up. This reflects the king's raging, uncontrolled temper. Rather than thinking about his actions, he seems to be lashing out with spite. A modern English language expression notes that, when a man's temper gets the best of him, it reveals the worst of him. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 9 wisely counsels, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." The real lesson to be learned will be delivered soon. Nebuchadnezzar is attempting to display his royal power. Soon the God of Israel will display his strength by rescuing his 3 loyal servants, Daniel 3 verses 24-25. Verse 21. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar once promoted these men to high office, Daniel 2 verses 48-49. Bitter rivals accused them of disobeying the king's command, Daniel 3 verses 8 and 12. The three Hebrews openly refused to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. In a fit of temper, the king ordered some of his soldiers to tie the Jews up and throw them into a superheated furnace, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 20. The clothing described would have been typical of Babylon in that era. Terms may vary, but the three Hebrews were likely wearing an undergarment, overgarment, and possibly ceremonial clothing. Execution victims would probably be stripped, in most cases, but here the king wants them executed instantly. None of this was necessary, but it all suited the king's intense rage at being defied. God will thwart every detail of this temper tantrum. The men will survive, Daniel 3 verse 26, without even their clothes smelling like smoke, Daniel 3 verse 27, though their restraints will be dissolved, Daniel 3 verse 25. Only the king's soldiers will be killed, Daniel 3 verse 22. Nearly the same information will be repeated, Daniel 3 verse 23, as part of a pattern in this chapter. This segment repeats certain phrases and ideas, both for emphasis and as a way of satirizing the bureaucracy and control of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Verse 22. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The furnace used here was probably a lime kiln, a large earthen dome with an open top to insert fuel and a hole on the side to remove waste. In his intense rage, King Nebuchadnezzar had ordered it superheated for an execution, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 19. Strong men were commanded to tie up 3 Hebrew captives, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, and throw them into this furnace immediately. This urgency contributed to the deaths of these executioners, Daniel 3 verses 20 to 21. To respond so quickly, they may have neglected to put on protective clothing. They likely had no time to arrange a careful way to put the victims into the top of the furnace. These were respected soldiers in the army of Babylon, previously referred to with the term mighty men, Daniel 3 verse 20. But the greatest warrior is no match for heat that can melt bronze. Nor is such a man strong enough to resist judgment by the one true God, whom these Hebrew men worshipped. Someday, during what is commonly called the end times, all nations of the world will attempt a military coup against God, but they will not be able to withstand his judgment. Revelation 20 verses 7 to 10. Psalm 2 verse 1 asks, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together, against the El and against his anointed. Psalm 2 verse 5 says God will speak to them in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury. Based on the king's comments later, Daniel 3 verses 24 to 25, it's not likely the soldiers fell into the furnace. More likely, they were overcome with the heat coming from the opening and died on the surface. Verse 23. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. These 3 men are captive Israelites, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, promoted to high office, Daniel 2 verses 48 to 49, who refused to obey the king's command to commit idolatry, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. In a rage, the king demanded they be tied up and immediately thrown into a superheated fire, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 21. The furnace was so hot that it killed the men sent to throw the Hebrews into the flames, Daniel 3 verse 22. Nebuchadnezzar has fulfilled his threat against those who refuse to worship his golden image, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7. Yet God would soon fulfill his will in the lives of his 3 faithful servants. Nebuchadnezzar's era used kilns to process limestone into quicklime, a cheap and useful chemical. A large kiln, or furnace, might be made of earth or brick, with a large opening at the top and a smaller port on the side. Lime and fuel would be layered from the top, and the shape of the kiln would allow airflow to maintain the fire. That the 3 Hebrew men fell into the fire likely means they were dragged to the top of the kiln and pushed into the open hole. This might also explain why the executioners died. If the furnace was drastically overheated, even the brick might have been dangerous to touch. This verse repeats nearly the same information found in an earlier verse, Daniel 3 verse 21. Much of Daniel chapter 3 features repetitive phrases. This includes a list of instruments, Daniel 3 verses 5 and 7, 10, 15, the execution device, Daniel 3 verses 6 and 11, 15, 17, 20, 21, 26, and around a dozen duplications of the phrase, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This not only adds poetic flair, but it also mocks the heavy-handed, overbearing nature of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." The furnace, in this incident, was probably a lime kiln with an opening near the bottom used to remove waste and ashes as well as to allow air to flow through the fire. Nebuchadnezzar has acted with intense rage at being defied, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18, commanding a series of foolish steps, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 23, to demonstrate his power over these Hebrew men, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7. As part of his spite, the king seems to have taken a seat where he could watch his victims burn, likely through the opening in the side of the furnace. What he sees causes the king to stand up in shock. His comments are something like asking, "Am I seeing things? Do you see what I see?" Certainly, God intended the king to see the miracle being performed in the fire. What Nebuchadnezzar witnesses proves God's power is far beyond that of any earthly ruler, Daniel 3 verse 15. The advisors confirm that only 3 men fell into the fire. The unfortunate executioners probably died on top of the furnace trying to push the Hebrews into the hole, Daniel 3 verse 22. Yet the king will claim he sees 4 people, who are not only alive, but unrestrained and moving. The king will refer to one of these 4 figures as resembling a son of the gods, Daniel 3 verse 25, and later as an angel or messenger of the God of the Israelite men, Daniel 3 verse 28. Verse 25. He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Babylon's king, Nebuchadnezzar, hatefully ordered that 3 men, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7, who defied his command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 1 to 7, 12, be tied up and thrown into a superheated furnace, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 23. Some commentators suggest that what he sees now was a spiritual vision, implying that the king was reacting to spiritual insight, rather than looking into the flames. And yet, his words and actions suggest he was indeed watching, probably out of the same spite that caused him to order the execution, Daniel 3 verse 24. This fire is probably part of a furnace or an ancient lime kiln, which had openings on both the top and the side. Through the lower gap, the king perhaps expected to see the remains of 3 Hebrew captives. Instead, he sees 4 figures, untied, and moving. Hebrews 11 verse 34 alludes to this miracle by remarking that by faith believers quenched the power of fire. The word quenched, as used in those contexts, most literally means made ineffective. The fire was not extinguished, but it had no power over the men inside. One of the 4 figures is described as like a son of the gods. It's possible this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, or it may have simply been an angelic being such as Michael the archangel, Daniel 10 verse 13, 12:1. Some translations suggest Nebuchadnezzar referred to this person as like the Son of God. This would be an incredibly precise reference to Jesus. However, the pagan king had no knowledge of Hebrew prophecy, nor a worldview including God the Son as described by the Bible. Rather, what the king saw was a 4th figure of unmistakably supernatural power. Before their ordeal, the 3 Hebrew men confidently told the king they would not worship his idol. They were confident that God could save them, despite Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, Daniel 3 verse 15. They were prepared to die for their faith, knowing God was not obligated to rescue them, but trusting that the Lord would do what was best, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. Here, their faith is validated. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. Leading up to this moment, Babylon's king, Nebuchadnezzar, was absolutely enraged by the defiance of 3 Hebrew captives, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. In his anger, he commanded them to be thrown, immediately, into a superheated furnace, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 23. Apparently, the king wanted to see the results of his spite, but instead of 3 charred corpses, he saw 4 men, all alive, and one with a supernatural appearance, Daniel 3 verses 24 to 25. This abruptly changes the king's attitude. In fact, he not only wants the men to come out from the furnace, but he also wants to speak with them in person. Here, the pagan king calls out to his intended victims, referring to them as servants of the Most High God. His meaning is literal, and different from how that phrase might be used by a modern believer. Nebuchadnezzar still believed in many deities, but this experience has convinced him that the God of Israel is not merely strong, Daniel 2 verse 47, but that he is the most powerful of these varied gods, Daniel 3 verse 29. This verse repeats the names of these 3 men, in the same pattern seen over a dozen times throughout the passage, Daniel 3 verses 12 and 13, 14, 16, 19, 20, 22, 23, 28, 29, 30. Repetition is a theme of this passage, in part for poetic rhythm, and partly to point out the heavy-handed nature of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Context summary: Daniel 3 verses 26 to 30 records the aftermath of King Nebuchadnezzar's failed attempt to punish those who defied his command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 19. The 3 men were seen alive inside a furnace, along with a 4th person, Daniel 3 verses 24 to 25. When the 3 emerge completely unaffected by the flames, the king shockingly acknowledges that their faith was well placed and that they were right to defy his order. He commands the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be protected from all criticism and promotes the 3 Hebrews once again, Daniel 2 verses 48 to 49. Verse 27. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. It's not surprising to read that many witnesses wanted to examine 3 men who had just experienced miraculous rescue. These men refused the king's order to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. The command was meant to affirm the supremacy of Babylonian gods. In response, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the Israelites bound, in their clothes, and thrown into a superheated furnace, Daniel 3 verses 19 to 23. Here, we see that every facet of the king's temper tantrum was foiled. The men survive, though the king's own soldiers died throwing them into the fire. They are free of their bonds, and even their clothes are unaffected, Daniel 3 verses 24 to 26. More importantly, the king is deeply struck by the supremacy of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel 1 verses 6 to 7. Moments ago, he was fuming in anger at being defied, but soon he will declare that these men were right to disobey his orders, Daniel 3 verse 28. This combination of details harmonizes with the language used to record this passage. Most of the Old Testament, including the book of Daniel, was written in Hebrew. This portion, Daniel 2:4, 7:28, is in Aramaic, the common language of Babylon in Daniel's era. These incidents speak to, or about, the Gentile people. Here, God makes it clear that the most powerful kings have no effect, whatsoever, on the Lord's power over his people or the affairs of the world. Mighty Nebuchadnezzar, king of the world's most powerful empire, was helpless against God's will. In the tribulation period 144,000 believing Jews will emerge unharmed from a fiery persecution during Antichrist's reign of terror, Revelation 7 verses 1-8, 12:13-14. Isaiah foretold this protection. In Isaiah 43 verses 1-3 he writes these words of God, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you, I have called you by my name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you, when you walk through fire you shall not be burned, and the flames shall not consume you. For I am the El your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." When the God of the Hebrews was credited with revealing Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel 2 verses 26-28, the king acknowledged that God's power, Daniel 2 verses 46-49. Yet in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, there was no reason Jews could not honor their God and also worship the deities of Babylon. He flew into an irrational rage when 3 Hebrew men refused his command to bow in front of an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16-19. They trusted that God could save them but resolved not to sin even if it cost them their lives. Here, Nebuchadnezzar's attitude is not merely reversed, but the pagan king also makes a shocking comment, that the 3 men were right to disobey his command. When he first challenged the Israelites, the king sarcastically asked what possible God could protect them from his royal wrath, Daniel 3 verse 15. That insincere question results in a sincere answer, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could, and he did just that, Daniel 3 verses 20-25. Verse 29. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. On multiple occasions, Nebuchadnezzar threatens those who disobey him with extreme violence, Daniel 2 verse 5, 3:6. Here, again, he demands his opinion be enforced on pain of gruesome death. Very recently, the king had sarcastically asked what deity could possibly save anyone from his wrath, Daniel 3 verse 15. He flew into a rage when 3 Hebrew men defied his orders, Daniel 3 verses 16-19. That suddenly changed when the men were miraculously rescued, Daniel 3 verses 24-26, and the king was forced to admit they'd been right to disobey his order, Daniel 3 verse 28. This was not a complete acceptance of the Israelites' Lord as the one true God, but it was an admission that he was wrong to demand Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship an idol. Nebuchadnezzar has come to admire the true God, but he did not rule out the existence of other gods. Nor did the king resolve to set those other idols aside. His initial anger was due to a misplaced belief that everyone, even the Jewish captives, could worship their own God and honor other gods. That confusion has not changed much, other than Nebuchadnezzar recognizing the power of the Israelite God to preserve his followers' lives. Only by trusting in God's Son as Savior can a person truly know God, John 1 verse 12, 14 verse 6, Acts 4 verse 12. Yet, even today, many people follow a subtle version of Nebuchadnezzar's mistake. They go through the motions of worshiping the Lord Sunday by Sunday without knowing Him personally. They believe it's possible to serve and honor other things, idols, and simply think of God as best of many options, Matthew 19 verses 20-24, Mark 10 verses 23-31, Luke 16 verse 13. Verse 30. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar received a God-ordained answer to his troubling dream, Daniel 2 verses 17-19, he responded with promotions for Daniel and his 3 friends, Daniel 2 verses 47-49. Those friends, Daniel 1 verses 6-7, have survived the king's rage at defying his command to worship an idol, Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. This caused Nebuchadnezzar to commend their faith and give them additional honors, Daniel 3 verses 28 to 29. Scholars differ on what the exact reward was. He may have restored them to their prior positions of rank and authority or elevated them to even higher positions. He may have given them favor, leading to their continued success. The three men are not mentioned again in Scripture. What happened to the three Hebrew men seemed terrible at first. Without doubt, what was done to them was irrational, evil, and horribly violent. Yet the Lord ensured the result was for their benefit. This turn of events echoes the experience of Joseph in the book of Genesis. After being betrayed by his brothers, he told them later, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." Genesis 50 verse 20. Saved survivors of the tribulation, too, will become prominent and occupy prestigious positions in Messiah's kingdom. They will supervise the business of cities during Jesus' millennial reign, Matthew 24 verses 45 and 47, 25 verses 21 and 23, Revelation 20 verse 4. End of Daniel chapter 3. Please note: the material used in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.